Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Experience Fridays. My name is Sharan. I'm the founder of Red, a UX design firm in Bangalore. This is Preeti, and we are uh, doing this Experience Fridays once a month just to meet interesting people and learn about things that we wouldn't normally run into on a regular basis. Today is another very interesting conversation, I'm sure, with Mr. Ajay Raghavan. Uh, Ajay has walked a very unique path, and I think I don't know if it was you know getting tired of the legal world or not, or tired of making too much money or what it is. But I think it was a walk down a path of conviction. That's how I read it. He was one of the senior partners at Trilegal, a very well-established legal firm that I know is in Bangalore, but I don't know if it's also in other cities in across India. I'll let Ajay talk about that. But today he quit that company and has now become a founder of both Bangalore Creative Circus as well as Initiative for Climate Action. And I think he walked this path because of his conviction about climate change. That's what I understand. So it's a very interesting path Ajay has taken, and I'd love to learn more about his path, his reasons for doing it, and also more about climate change. But I hope he can also talk to us about how we can participate as Red, as a design company, and in affecting climate change, positive measures towards climate change. So welcome, Ajay. Over to you.
Thanks, Sharan, and thanks for having me. Uh, I am a recovering lawyer, so partly sort of correct. Um, my own journey, I think, just around climate change was almost by sort of chance. I happened to see a documentary around the issue about 5 years ago, and it started by sort of feeling disbelief, and then I said, "Listen, this can't be true." But it had DiCaprio in it, so I said, "Listen, he seems like an authentic guy, so maybe I should read up a little more." And that's how it started. And I guess the more I read, the scarier it got for me. And that then took me on this journey where I tried to then reach out, and I spent, I think, close to about 2 years just meeting a number of people. I'm based in Bangalore, so I met a number of people on the government, on policy, in businesses, in the social sector, essentially trying to see where we were in terms of trying to do something about the problem. And that sort of led me to eventually say that, or believe that actually wasn't a problem of a lack of solutions. I think solutions existed. To some extent, I think it was a lack of awareness and people coming together to really work effectively on those solutions. So that's just the background. I've got a presentation, so I'm happy to just take you all through that.
Yes.
Just a little bit of a warning. It is the presentation itself is quite science heavy in some parts, and I apologize for that. But it is quite crucial to our ability to understand the problem effectively. It is, I think, quite essential to at least get a sense of what the science behind the problem is. That typically will then help each of us try and address the problem slightly, I think, slightly better. I'll get started. Yeah, is my screen on full screen? Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you. So before I start and get into the actual sort of substance of the presentation, I wanted to start with a hypothetical. And this, of course, uh, thanks to Red giving me this opportunity, I'm going to sort of make you my guinea pig for this hypothetical.
Uh-oh.
Here's the problem. So Mr. Raghavan is this rich real estate developer in Bangalore. He's met with the Red team and he's asked them to help develop an algorithm that can help him predict the city's real estate future. He wants to put his money behind in the right areas, and he really wants to understand what's happening. Red, of course, is getting lots of money for this, so they gladly oblige. And then they sort of build out this algorithm. And ultimately, suddenly they realize once they've built it, they've actually opened up a can of worms. The algorithm is now telling them that many parts of the city, including places like JP Nagar, Koramangala, Indranagar, are going to get flooded regularly in the next 5 years. And remember, many of the of people who work in Red actually have ground floor apartments in these areas. So now they're really worried. They're like, what's going to happen to my space? Um, they then of move forward and realize, this algorithm that we've created is really smart. Not only can it tell me what's happening in Bangalore, it can even tell me globally what's likely to happen over the next say 9 years. And this is what the algorithm is telling Red. It's telling us that over the period of the next 9 years, the planet will lose about 30% of all sea life, and coral reefs are likely to be almost completely wiped out. Sea levels will rise, and smaller islands will disappear. All major coastal cities, including New York, Mumbai, Gyeongju, and Kolkata, will face catastrophic flooding. A third of all animals, insects, and birds will get wiped out. The Arctic ice will disappear frequently. There will be about 150 million environmental refugees in this time. Extreme food and water shortage is likely to be there around the world. Disease and poverty will be rampant, and the GDP across the planet will take a significant beating, and the world will be faced with its worst economic crisis. Now, of course, this is an algorithm, it's hypothetical. So, of course, everyone at Red is massively shocked at this. Um, and then Preeti from Red, who I've been speaking to, suddenly remembers that, hey, 1 year ago, exactly on this day, I read an article in The Scientist, which is a very, very credible science publication. Um, and that predicted that the world as we know it would actually change quite dramatically in the next 2 months, of course, on account of a zoonotic disease. But she, like most of us, chose to ignore it. It's just science, somebody's saying something. Uh, of course, we all know how that played out. Um, but this time, I think on account of the fact that, things like this can actually happen, and there is this realization that science actually can say something that maybe we should listen to. The Red team this time decided that they're not taking any chances. They decided to listen to what the scientists are telling them and prepare for the future. Of course, being really smart, design thinking folks, the first thing the Red team wanted to do is understand the root of the problem so that they can then design for that change. Um, they reached out to the able folks at the Initiative for Climate Action, yours truly, uh, to help them appreciate the problem. And what they've done is they've promised to help us design a solution for this. So I'm going to really put this out to the Red team to say that at the end of this, I'd actually like to hear how you all design for something like this. Um, I'm going to now get into the actual science around it. Yeah, so in essence, what we saw was this idea of what causes climate change, and I think at a very basic level, um, the real culprit behind all of this is carbon dioxide, along with methane and nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide is a gas that is usually emitted. I mean, it's natural in the environment, but it's also enhanced by the burning of fossil fuels. So for electricity, when we use thermal plants, the cars that we drive that are of working on fossil fuel, also things like deforestation. So as we've started to cut out forests and cultivate more and more agriculture, and that agriculture has now become largely unsustainable, that leads to the release of carbon into the atmosphere. And because one of the greatest carbon sinks is our trees, and tree covers are getting depleted, we don't have anything that can actually capture the carbon that is being released into the atmosphere. So what's happened over the last 50 or 60 years, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere has constantly been increasing. And that's the root culprit of climate change. The question then is really, what is this too much? How much carbon are we releasing into the atmosphere, and why has it become a problem today? Why hasn't this been a problem in the past? Um, This is an interesting chart. If you look at it, for the last 650,000 years, the atmospheric carbon dioxide, or the amount of carbon dioxide that has remained in the atmosphere, has largely been on an average at about 250 parts per million. Uh, it's fluctuated a little bit over this significant period of time. I mean, just to give you a sense, about halfway through this is when the first human beings even appeared on the planet. So it's a really, really long period of time. And for that period of time, all the way till about 50 years ago, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has largely remained consistent. Since the 1950s and actually the 1970s, the amount of carbon that we have started to release into the atmosphere has almost doubled from our average levels. So today we're actually at about 406, I think, in parts per million. That's almost double of what we have had in the past. Now the question is yes, we understand. So over the last 50 years, we've got excess amounts of carbon being released into the atmosphere. But why is that relevant? I mean, why should we worry about something like that? Um, Here's the problem. Carbon is a heat of soaking gas. What it does is it traps heat. If you look at the chart on the left, that is a period of I guess, the last 150 odd years, where for all the way till the turn of the early of 19, maybe 1960s, if you see the proportion, and the previous chart shows you how much carbon dioxide there was in the atmosphere, that carbon dioxide has increased substantially over this period. And as you can see, with the increase of carbon dioxide, there's also an increase on the amount of heat at an atmospheric level. The average temperature of the planet has remained largely the same for thousands of years. That's approximately at about 14 degrees centigrade. So if you look at that, that's essentially the entire global temperature. So if you took temperature averages across the planet, starting from the Arctic down to the tropics and everywhere else, uh, if you took the average of that, we have over thousands of years almost remained the same, which is at 14 degrees, with a little bit of spike here and there. We've never really dramatically changed from that number. Um, since the mid 20th century, the global average temperature has actually been going up year on year. Uh, and we're now currently at almost 1.1 degree more than we were in the pre industrial era. Um, a 1 degree global change is actually significant, because when you think of a 1 degree change in one place, it actually could be a 5 or 6 degree of difference in another place. So the 1 degree is an average temperature, which means that to achieve that average, you need dramatic changes of temperatures across the planet. And that's what's been happening in the last couple of years. In the last, when we've actually had these spikes in the past, and you can see it in some of the dips in the graph, we've actually had some very extreme weather patterns on the planet. In fact, I think in the 16th century, we had the Little Ice Age, which Europe plunged into a significant cold wave for many, many years together, on account of the fact that the temperature had actually dropped for a period of time. Um, Here's what this is showing us. The last 10 years on the planet have actually been, in fact, the last 10 hottest years on the planet have all been recorded on this in this side of the century. 2016 and 2020, which is just come out, have tied for the hottest years on the planet. Uh, 19 out of the 20 hottest years have been in this decade. So if you look at it, there's a direct correlation between the increase in carbon and greenhouse gases that's led to an increase in the temperature across the planet, that has led to heating of our cities and everything else that we see. Now, all of this is fine, but what does any of this mean? What does this 1 degree mean? What does this 1.5 degree mean? And why does it impact any of us? That's the question that uh, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, which is a UN led body. There's a global body that came together to say this temperature that is increasing. What happens now? We're starting to see something happen, but can we actually predict what is likely to happen to the planet and different aspects of the planet as we hit these numbers? And this is what the report essentially said. So the IPCC special report is a report that was a follow through from the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement essentially, you probably heard of this term, is an agreement where we had about 190. I mean, it was a landmark agreement, because for the first time we actually got about 195 different state subjects come together, sign a treaty effective in November 2016, which agreed that we would try at a planetary level to keep the increase of the global average temperature well below 2 degrees, uh, above pre-industrial of levels, but certainly to try and limit that increase to 1.5 degrees. Um, the report was authored by about 224 sort of scientists from across the world. These were very, very well-established scientists who came together. I mean, think of it like a McKinsey report into just 100x of the credibility, because we've got some of the best scientists across the world sitting on this problem and trying to of recognize where the challenges were and articulate it. They ran through over 6,000 different scientific publications, spent 3 years of research time to create this particular report. And it took into consideration almost 42,000 government review comments before it was eventually published worldwide. And this was in October of 2018. Um, the one thing to recognize is when governments of the world actually go out and publish something, it means there's a whole bunch of iterations at the back end. There's lots of push from businesses, from other vested interest to make sure that some of this reporting is at a manageable level. So let's just assume that this particular document, while it may be the scientific truth, it perhaps is tempered down a little bit because this was released by governments across the world. The two key questions that they attempted to ask was, the first one being, what happens to the planet when it warms up by 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees? And how soon are we likely to get to this number? So that's really two questions that this particular research paper attempted to, very, very of credible research paper attempted to address, which is just the idea of the temperature on the planet, the average temperature, when it goes up by these two, by 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, what happens? They essentially, while it talks about a number of things, 6 or 7 main areas stick out. They really did the research around these 6 or 7 areas. And I'm going to very briefly talk through those areas and the findings of them. The first one was around Arctic ice. The Arctic ice is probably one of the most important things that we have on the planet from the perspective of being able to manage weather patterns. The Arctic today is heating 2 to 3 times faster than remaining parts of the world, um, on account of the way the planet is of aligned, and the fact that ice is white and it attracts more heat. So summers with no remaining Arctic ice are 10 times more likely to happen at 2 degrees than 1.5 degrees. But it's still saying that there is a possibility that the planet at 1.5 degrees will not have any Arctic ice. Now, why is that relevant? Disappearing sea ice is actually connected to the jet streams that we have across the planet. Just jet streams are really the systems that help weather patterns across the planet stay regular and of I mean, it's like this, the thing that always fascinates me. How is it that on the 1st of June, the rain always, at least for many, many years, we knew that on the 1st of June, the monsoons would hit would hit a part of India. It's gone. This of predictability has been on for years and years on account of the fact that these systems have always been consistent and have never been challenged in the way that there has been too much change in the system. Now, these jet streams actually are the ones that create. So when you've got hot air from the tropics moving up to the northern of hemisphere, the Arctic ice does this great thing of cooling this heat, this hot of jet streams as it's moving up. And those two, the convergence of these two essentially then cause weather patterns. So moisture moves, rainfall of happens in one or the other. Now, what happens is when a weather system or the Arctic ice melts, these weather systems can actually get quite stuck, because now you have a lot more of heat, but you don't have a cooling system, which then creates really intense heat waves. It's likely to create floods, droughts, and other extreme events across the planet. The volume of ice in the Arctic that has already declined is about 70% over just the last 40 years. And this is on account of this heating. Uh, some of the extreme weather events that we've seen in the recent past are on account of some of these problems. The other big problem with the Arctic is it has something called permafrost. Permafrost is essentially this huge amount of ice that lies below the Arctic. So it's below the sea level, but many of them go kilometers deep into the sea, and much of this has never ever melted in thousands of years because they've remained exactly the same way. With this heating, what's happening is those sort of things that have never melted are now starting to melt, and that's releasing uh, viruses and bacteria that have been trapped in those of cubes of ice over many years, and those are being released, and that's now causing new types of disease and challenges at a planetary level. um, so limiting global warming at to 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees is projected to prevent the thawing of an area of permafrost the size of Mexico. So you see that a zero point 0.5 degree difference in the sort of temperature on the planet can have a very dramatic impact on a number of different systems. Um, like we just saw in one of the earlier slides, we can already see that the last 20, 19 years have been some of the hottest on the planet. So climate change is already playing out. Extreme heat will be much more common worldwide and even worse in the tropics. Like I'd said, 1 to 4 degrees is the average increase we can see in many areas, especially on coastal belts. Um, at these temperatures, it's talking about how often uh, populations across the planet will have heat waves, and you can see that number moves from 14 to 37% with a zero point 0.5 degree change. Higher risks of heavy precipitation, because as the oceans sort of heat up more, there's a lot more precipitation that leads to far more rainfall and extreme tropical events, which then leads to category 4 and 5 cyclones that we've seen as recently as last year. Um, or the increased number of hot days are also likely to increase. They're saying that places like Calcutta are likely to be far more vulnerable on account of where it's placed and what's likely to happen to its system. The report also talks about water scarcity and disease. It says that at 1.5 degrees, 350 million urban people, this is just urban people across the planet, are likely to face significant water scarcity. Bangalore, as many of you all know, is already in the top three places across the planet in terms of cities that are vulnerable to water scarcity. And therefore, this is really relevant to us. Farm stress, again, in the context of India, lack of water or predictable of water supply can significantly impact the way that agriculture happens in India. And increased temperatures are also a big threat to disease. So things like malaria and dengue tend to be a far greater threat at high of temperate levels. There was a recent assessment on the Himalayas. The Himalayas actually is a very significant source of fresh water for millions of people who live downstream from both in India, China, and all of the other sort of parts of the Himalayas. As these glaciers are melting, and these reports are saying that these glaciers, like the Arctic ice, are melting at really rapid levels. What happens is once the glaciers melt, there's no water for people downstream. So it's already starting at some level. It's going to start with things like what happened with Uttarakhand, where you have extreme of water coming down because of the melting of glaciers. But you also then have, over prolonged periods of time, the ice is not able to come back, which then means a huge depletion of fresh water. Um, Plants and animals, the report is saying that um, we're going to have significant impact. Even at 1.5 degrees, we're likely to lose quite a large population of the millions and billions of insects, plants, and vertebrates that live on the planet. We've already wiped out about 60% of all of the planet's wildlife in the last 100 years. Um, Sea level rise and ocean acidification. Uh, this is essentially, the idea is that oceans, because of this, I mean, we've got a lot more ocean than we have land, and as oceans are also great heat trappers, so what they do is they take a lot of the greenhouse gas, absorb it into the water. But what's happening there is, because the water is constantly heating, it's leading not just to things like stream or weather pattern changes. It's also leading to uh, acidification of the ocean itself. And the ocean, as you know, is actually the largest source of wildlife on the planet. It serves many different purposes. Many of them in the natural ecosystem are super important to the planet. So with the heating of the ocean, it starts to lead to what is called acidification. which then means that a lot of what exists within the ocean starts to be challenged in terms of its ability to thrive. So at these temperatures, at about 1.5 degrees and at 2 degrees, so it's saying at 2 degrees, we lose all of the coral reefs across the planet. About 90% of it will get lost at 1.5 degrees. So we're saying that we're almost in at that threshold of starting to lose. From some of the studies I've seen, we've already lost about 40 to 50%, and that loss is going to get more rapid in the coming years. Um, Fish are actually most of the fishing that happens across the planet happens in waters that are close to coastal belts. That's also because those are the belts that are rich in coral reefs, and a lot of the fish really survive and thrive around the corals. With the coral sort of loss, what's happening is that fish across all of these areas are starting to get wiped out. So 30% of all fish in the ocean will get wiped out if coral reefs disappear. Marine fishery will start to decline. So that's going to have massive, not just economic impact, but also nutritional impact for people who live on the coast. Um, the report is saying that about 69 million people worldwide will be impacted at 1.5 degrees and about 80 million people worldwide at 2 degrees by rising sea levels. Coastal India is very vulnerable. These reports specifically call out Bombay and Calcutta as being very, very high on the flood risk. And as many of you all of me have noticed, we had Amphan, Nisarga, and Nivar, three massive cyclones last year. The one, at least the one that hit Orissa and West Bengal, had widespread destruction. We've lost not just people, but significant cultivable land in the Sudarban. So there's a whole bunch of things that then are connected to these. And this is today. This is not even, we haven't even hit 1.5 degrees. We're at 1.1 degree today, and we're already seeing a lot of this change. And finally, I think global crops. So our entire farming industry across the planet is dependent on weather being reliable and stable. Uh, this change in temperature, especially when it's getting warmer, it's starting to have huge sort of impacts on our agriculture, especially in India, where about 70% of all of rural India is actually primarily dependent on agriculture as a livelihood. And even within that, the studies are saying that in India, most agricultural lands are being cultivated by women. So that makes it even more vulnerable for them. Decreased food availability as a result of dip in food production will lead to another huge sort of issues, whether that's malnutrition or lack of food security across the planet. It's very clear that this report is saying that we're likely to face that. It's also saying specifically that millions of Indians are likely to be impacted because India is particularly vulnerable to climate change on account of a whole bunch of things. So what is the sort of summary in terms of summary? What does the IPCC report say? It's actually saying that all of these things that I just talked about, and in fact, if you remember the hypothetical, I talked about a bunch of things. All of those things are actually predicted to happen in the next 9 years. Uh, the science is telling us that this 1.1 degree, while it took us about 50 years to get here, because we've now got to this heat level, everything is now going to be accelerated. So every 0.5 sort of degree increase is actually going to happen at a much faster pace. We're likely to hit 1.5 degrees in 9 years. That's 2030. Many of us are hopefully going to be around then. So we will we're going to face the brunt of this. The report is saying that in order to keep global warming within this 1.5 degrees, we're going to have to reduce the amount of carbon that we are releasing into the atmosphere by about 45% of our 2010 level. So if you see where we are at 2010, which is close to 40, it's telling you we should be at about less than 20 by 2030. So not only do we need to of decrease, and unfortunately what's happened since 2010 till now, that number has been steadily increasing. It hasn't been reducing. So we literally have to cut our sort of carbon levels by almost 50% in order to achieve net zero emission by 2050. Steering the world into such a pathway will require rapid and far-reaching transitions and deep emission reductions in all sectors. So we have to, whether this is energy, whether this is mobility, whether this is of agriculture, all of these systems need to transition very, very quickly to be able to remain under this 1.5 degree temperature limit that we're talking about. Global power systems will need to switch to about close to about 90%, 85 to 90% by 2050. This is moved to renewables. We have to reduce fossil fuel use and completely stop the use of coal by 2050. And all pathways limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees requires the use of carbon dioxide removal. So it's not just the fact of saying, okay, let's take fossil fuel and stop it. It's the situation today is increasingly sort of becoming so bad that we need to now find technology that it can actually of start to, I mean, obviously the greatest technology out there is trees. But if we wanted to do this in a slightly different, more accelerated way, we do need technology that can actually start to pull a lot of this carbon from the atmosphere and find another use for it. Um, so yeah, so in terms of solutions, I mean, I've talked a lot about the science of climate change, and clearly now, I guess the recognition that the planet is warming at a very, very rapid rate, and that rate is unsustainable, largely for human life. I always tell people this: there's our planet. We talk about climate change being sort of detrimental to the planet. Nothing's going to happen to the planet. The planet will, it's continued for years. It'll continue to exist for many years. What the people who or the most impacted in all of this are likely to be animals and people. So in many ways, the greatest threat here is really to human beings on account of climate change. So we need to recognize and accept that this is an existential threat to humanity. We need to really deal with this in the way that we're dealing with something like COVID, which is with a sense of urgency. We can't continue to sort of allow for this to happen and not intervene. So any solution is going to require significant urgent action. There is no silver bullet in terms of, unlike COVID, where you've got a vaccination. Unfortunately, we don't have that vaccination to get rid of climate change. We're going to need to work on a number of different solutions. We need awareness and action at all levels. So whether you're an individual, whether it's at a local or a town or a city level, whether it's at a country level, and finally, even at a global level, the idea of treaties and countries across the planet coming together, India, China, the US, countries that are releasing huge amounts of fossil fuel into the atmosphere, or sort of carbon into the atmosphere, all of these need to act. And finally, the truth is climate change is a solvable problem. It was created by human beings. It can be solved by human beings. But as the science is telling us, we need to act now. We don't have a lot of time. These things, once they get to a tipping point, it's almost impossible to pull back. And we're almost at that point where we're getting to the tipping point. The solutions at an individual level, I think a lot of people want to know what I can do. So I think it starts by just understanding the science, read a little more, try and understand what climate change really is, or the science is telling us around climate change, and then spread awareness, especially locally. Try and sort of do it within your own ecosystem. Ask questions to public officials and organizations. So whether you're a business or you're the government, we need to be asking questions around what they're doing in terms of how they're of creating things, and questions around carbon release. Um, Lifestyle changes, so our ability to try and move from conventional sources of energy, which is fossil fuel based, to renewable sources like solar and wind. Um, but obviously, the more people who do this, the larger this will be at scale. Food, moving to smarter dietary levels. Methane is a large part of what you also saw in one of the earlier slides around methane is caused by unsustainable animal farming that we've got. So cows are one of the biggest contributors to the methane release on the planet. So moving to slightly more sustainable food diets, even plant-based diet, the idea of moving to sustainable food systems, we need to reduce the amount of waste we've got at a planetary level, but also at an individual level. Transportation, I think all of us could try and sort of uh, find more carbon friendly ways of traveling, whether that's through electric mobility or using public transport, finding better ways to do this. And finally, responsible consumption, which is reduce the amount that you use be mindful of where the product came from, where it'll go, because a lot of us consume and then we dump it into a dustbin. We don't know where it goes back into landfills, it goes into spaces that are constantly creating more trouble. So avoid and avoid single use plastic. So these are just some of the many things that we can do at an individual level. You could also volunteer and donate to organizations working on climate action. And I think take up problems as opportunities, as I'll talk through very quickly in a later slide. This problem actually presents a whole bunch of opportunities that many people are now recognizing across the planet. And by trying to solve for it, I think there's people are making a difference. Um, I don't know if you want to stop and take questions, but I've just got a couple of more slides, and then Sharon, if you think, I'd be happy to stop and take questions.
We can do it at the end. Yeah.
Sure, thanks. Um, at a personal level, I just wanted to quickly talk through two organizations that I'm a part of. One called the Initiative for Climate Action, and the other Bangalore Creative Circus. They're both organizations that are primarily focused on what you've just seen, which is solving the problems around climate change and actually acting on them. The Initiative for Climate Action was set up about 8 months ago. It was a couple of lawyers and I think a sociologist who came together to set it up. Our goal as an organization is to try and build on something we call climate heaven, which is really a better world for all, where nobody's sort of left behind. But equally recognizing that things like inequality and justice are likely to be become far greater problems. Resource scarcity is likely to lead to conflict between not just sort of states, but countries even. So recognizing these things and then trying to sort of transform. So we believe that by creating transformational or transformative climate action, we can actually make this idea of climate heaven possible. The group is based on a really diverse bunch of people. We've got about 40 different volunteers, from climate scientists to creative people to lawyers to policy people, to business people. So it's a very diverse group of people, all of whom are interested in the climate, but are coming into it from a slightly different perspective or a slightly different experience. And we're finding that that's really helping to allow for this conversation to become more holistic. Uh, like I talked about, the organization is based on the idea of creating transformative climate action, which is to really look at the problem holistically and then to try and solve for it. Systems thinking and design thinking at some level is a very important part of what we are sort of recognizing and trying to do, because recognizing that the climate is a problem is not just one thing, but it requires the understanding of a whole system based on which you can then tinker and design for it. We're building something called a climate university, which is essentially to enable people to go out and actually do climate action. So what does it take? How do I understand the climate? How do I then understand, say, the legislative framework? How do I understand the problems? How do I also recognize what solutions are out there? And finally, how do I empower you to go out and do something? So that's the idea of the climate university. I think at the center of it for us is the idea of empathy, and building a certain cultural ethos, which will allow us to achieve a lot of what we want to do. We're also trying to build out research around the future of climate action in India, which is to say that these are where the opportunities are likely to be, and this is how of people can respond to it at a country level in terms of climate action. And finally, amongst the various projects that the ICA is involved in, this one I think is particularly exciting. It's a project where we are working with a group called Socrates. There is an individual called Rajesh Kasturirangan. I think he did his PhD from. He's a mathematics and cognitive science professor from. I think he did his PhD in MIT, and we've come together to really say, what if we took a ward, and the ward in this particular sort of situation is Ward 44, which is in Yashwantpur, and said that how do we work on building a climate resilient ward? So recognizing that you've got government, business, of communities, a whole bunch of different things, energy, water, waste, all of these systems, and saying that how can we take the system, map it out, and then build for a system that is resilient and can adapt to a lot of what is coming our way. So the idea of say Koramangala and JP Nagar being sort of where flooding is much higher. These are real things. A lot of the localized climate science is actually telling us that pockets in Bangalore are very vulnerable. And the idea for us is to say, how can we really localize this and create a system that can be more resilient at a ward level, and then scale it up to other wards and the city itself. Um, Bangalore Creative Circus is really a physical platform. It's a 20,000 square feet warehouse that's based in Yashwantpur. And the idea of the platform is really to try and draw people together using art and science as a medium. So we want to sort of really creatively draw people into the space and then sort of pass on awareness and solutions around climate change. So we're building a climate museum. We're trying to sort of get people to demonstrate. We're trying to demonstrate these actual solutions around what you can do with, say, energy in your house, or water or waste or composting, or all of these things. How do you actually understand and access these solutions? uh, the space itself is meant to be a collaborative space where lots of different people who work on climate change and sustainability can come together and work together to actually design for a lot of this change. It's meant to be Bangalore's sustainability hub. And a big part of our sort of focus is really to work with young people and to make sure that we can help them work through some of the challenges that climate change is likely to bring them. Um, One of the big identifications, and this is interesting, and a lot of people perhaps are missing this, but the World Economic Forum recently came out with a risk report for the last year. They published it sometime recently. And it's identified that if you look at the list on the left-hand side of this, if you look at two, which is biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, natural catastrophes, extreme weather events, human-made environmental catastrophes, failure of climate change adaptation, and food crisis. So about 6 to 7 of the 10 most uh, sort of things that are considered the greatest risk for doing business on the planet last year are actually on account of climate change. So you can already see that the world is starting to recognize what a threat this is. There was an opinion poll that actually was published today in some of the papers. Um, and this was a combination of the UNDP, which is a part of the United Nations, and Oxford University, where they actually questioned about 1.2 million people. This is the largest study that has been done in 50 different countries, to ask them about how they feel about climate change. And it's interesting that about two-thirds, that's roughly about 80 or 90 million people, young people across, and in this is group, has actually said that we should be calling it a global emergency in the same way that we are responding to things like COVID. 69% of this group who've said this are actually aged under the age of 18. So you can see that about a third or 70% of the globe of people under 18 actually feel that climate change is something that is very, very significant and should be treated as an emergency. In the same form, sort of study, they found that about 58% of those above the age of 60 agreed. Now, this is really interesting because these studies have been happening for a couple of years, and even as close as about 5 years ago, these numbers were way less than 50%. They were in the 20 or 30% from what I've seen a couple of years ago. That has changed dramatically in the last 2 or 3 years, partly on account, at least with young people. I would give a large part of that credit to a young person called Greta Thunberg. She was about 16 when she brought this up. So a lot of Europe sat up and listened to her. A lot of the UK's policies around climate actually emerged on account of the fact that one 18-year-old stood up and called out what was happening at a planetary level. And it's got people across the world to get interested and actually work on the problem. The other massive opportunity is, now that we've recognized, and across the planet, people are recognizing that this is a real threat. They're also seeing it as a massive opportunity. A World Economic Forum report has actually talked about the fact that we've got a $50 trillion investment opportunity in the green transition. So as we move from where we are to I guess, a more sustainable world, the investment that is likely, or the investment opportunity is likely to be more significant than anything else out there. Um, and interestingly, if you look at McKinsey reports over the last year or so, s- uh, the ones that I've seen, a majority of those reports actually talk about climate change now in a very significant way. So all of the new financial reports are saying that climate change is something that everyone needs to sit up and sort of, at least if you're a business, you have to take attention. The World Economic Forum, as you can see from these reports, is constantly sort of talking about this. Um, Interestingly, the US elections this year, the Biden administration actually put climate front and center as one of the top three election agendas, and has immediately uh, after he came into office, actually re-signed the United States back into the Paris Convention. So clearly, you can see that there is a big push at a US administration sort of level of both recognition as well as seeing the opportunities in this transition. Tesla, as many of you all probably know, Elon Musk is now the wealthiest person on the planet. How did he get there? He sold electric cars. You can see that that's where a lot of the future is likely to lie, moving in that. He's also put out $100 million fund for people, for somebody who can provide a solution around carbon capture. Um, ESG is the new buzzword in the investment space across the planet. It essentially puts environment, social, and governance at the head of anything. So it says before you take any investment decision, and this is all of the big investment funds across the planet have now said that that company needs to be a certified ESG company, which means that on the environmental front, on the social front, on the governance front, the company needs to have achieved a certain target. And if it doesn't, uh, funds across the planet are saying we will not put money into that company. Pension funds are a classic example of that fund. So pension funds are some of the biggest or have the largest corpuses across the planet for investment. So the Canadian pension fund, the Qatari pension fund, the Japanese pension fund, all of these funds have now said that if you are not ESG certified, or if your organization is not environmentally compliant, and climate change being a big part of that environmental sort of part of it, we will not put money. So I think that's leading to a whole bunch of people seeing this as a new opportunity, but also getting a lot of older companies to now say that the only way we will get funding in future is if we transition. So there is a big push at a business level, at a policy level, and obviously that will then lead to better sort of opportunities even at the social level. So that's it. Thanks. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you for that, Ajay. That was wonderful. Um, as always, a good presentation always leaves a lot of questions to be asked over here. So I'll ask you some of the stuff that's being asked on chat. Then I'll ask you some of my own. One of the issues I think a person by the name of Radhika has brought up is that industrial uh, pollutants versus food production. Which of these is the greater, what do you call it, polluter? And does it matter actually which one is a worse polluter? What are your thoughts on that?
Um, I mean, it's hard to say one or the other, right? Because it's all contributing to something. It's like saying, would you prefer do you prefer lung cancer, or do you prefer stomach cancer? Right? I don't know. It's almost like that question, and I don't mean it in a rude way, but these are both very very important things. I think that both of these, what we're doing at a planetary level, uh, agriculture is clearly a very very significant problem on account of a number of different things. One is it's not just what we're doing with the forest. So if you see disease, for instance, by moving into animal habitats, which is what we're doing for more agricultural land, and that's what unsustainable agriculture is about. As we start to deplete the soil that we currently have and move into forest areas, that's where we're getting sort of conflicts with animal and things like disease happening. But we're also in a really vulnerable place with agriculture because there is huge dependencies across the planet. Today, a significant part of the planet depends on agriculture, not just for its livelihood, but its ability to exist. Um, so with sort of depletion, one is the pollution that it or what it's doing. There's also a deep health impact, and this is not just on account of climate change, but also what we're doing with the soil. The more fertilizers and pesticides we add into the soil, the less there can be microorganisms in the soil. So microbes are actually the most important thing for sort of sequestering carbon into the atmosphere. So these microbes suck a lot of that carbon, put it into the soil and trap it down there. As we kill all of these microbes, it then sort of leaves soil where you have to constantly add additives to it, many of which are hugely unsustainable even at a planetary level. So release of toxins into the atmosphere, release of, I mean, think of it, all of the toxins that are going into the soil are also going into those plants. Those
Right.
plants are the ones that we're eating. So they're showing links between things like cancer and food that we're eating. So there are many, the whole bunch of challenges around agriculture. So it is, I think, agriculture in itself is a beast that has to be managed and handled. And many countries, I think, including India, have now recognized that we have to transition into more sustainable ways of working with agriculture. Meat consumption, of course, is also a massive challenge, but then it's also quite, it's also, there's a huge amount of inequity in the idea of meat, especially in India. Meat actually is consumed by the poorest of the population in India. And if you then sort of suddenly say, okay, stop eating meat, that is, it's really, really sort of high on protein and nutrition for poor people, you're then sort of taking away something. So there's a whole bunch of these challenges around where do you want to be. The West consumes a lot more meat than we do in India per capita, and a lot of the problems. So the biggest meat producing country on the planet is Brazil. Where is all of that meat sort of coming from? They're cutting into the Amazon and creating more cultivable land for these. So they're all connected problems. So I'd say that in terms of I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I've addressed the question, but I think if it was around agriculture and microbes and forests and things like that, that for me, that's where the worry and the link is.
Sure. In your conversations with various people, I think in various roles, what are you seeing as a level of awareness between on a people level, on a institutional level, and on the government level? If you had those conversations, are you
Um,
seeing a change?
sure. I think it was quite poor when, I mean, even as long as a couple of years ago, I would speak to people. Not too many people understood or even thought it was relevant.
Right.
Um, Increasingly, and I'm not sure what has triggered this in my head. It could be a number of different things, starting with young people getting involved in the protests, starting with government starting to see this as a financial threat and a political threat. A lot more very, very relevant science coming out. So in the last couple of years, we've got far better understandings and information that's being shared around these problems. So I think that certainly today there's a lot more people who are looking at this as something that is relevant. So and for me, it's. I mean, I'm speaking to somebody from Citibank, and as recent as 3 months ago, Citibank has said that all future investments that or companies that we back need to have ESG clearance and recognizing that environment has become big, not just externally but within the organization as well. In that sense, I certainly think there is more awareness, but we're quite far from an ideal position on it.
I mean, the biggest people who can make systemic changes are people in government or people in power of some kind, like the Gates Foundation and such. Uh, are you seeing that awareness even at those levels? Is it a hopeful scenario?
I mean, certainly some of the largest, the Gates Foundation for sure has been involved in a number of environmental issues. I think a lot of their spending over the last year was around COVID and what happened. And a number of non-profits across the world who are putting money on the investment side were really doing it to respond to a very specific crisis that we had, that we continue to have. But climate is certainly on the agenda for many of these organizations. I think some of the biggest corporations, so both Amazon, Microsoft, and Tesla have all put $1 million funds behind the climate in terms of trying to find new technologies, trying to find new sort of ways of energy. So there is, I think, at least at an institutional level, in terms of corporations and some of the governments, we had we've also had the challenge of the last US government not accepting this, and that's had a big impact across the planet. Now with the new government, I think there is certainly a lot more optimism across uh, various parts of this ecosystem, saying that now there's likely to be a much bigger push on these agendas. So in that sense, I do think that there is more awareness.
Uh, I'm going to ask you about as an entrepreneur. If I was to invest in a business, you've got a 4 or 5 year or a 3 to 4 year gestation period, after which you start seeing some returns on thing. But you've mapped out a 9 year time frame in which we're going to see some high levels of impact in environmental change. Uh, does it still make sense or to do this on an individual entrepreneur level, or does this is this necessarily a systemic or a systems level kind of thing that we need to think about it?
I mean, it's a good question because I think very often, and this is the problem with communicating the idea of climate, right? You've got a report that is telling us that we will hit a number where we're literally saying we will almost self-destruct at some level.
Yeah.
And we're saying we have to wait till we get to that number. Let's self-destruct and then figure out how to deal with it.
Right.
It's telling us today where that threat is already there. It may not be as extreme as perhaps in 9 years, but I think a large part of the recognition that today I mean, to just give you some examples, factories that are located in some of the areas across Bangalore have clearly suddenly recognized that, and many of these factories, for most factories in India, we're still very dependent on water for cooling systems, for sort of cleaning systems, for a whole bunch of different operation level things. Water tables, most of them were getting their water from bore wells in the ground. In and around Bangalore, that has significantly dried up. And again, people who are working in the water space is telling us that that will go far more rapidly. So there are certain areas, high industrial areas in Bangalore, and this is of course across the world, but I'm being specific about Bangalore, that already are facing significant water shortage problems. So as an entrepreneur, and even the example of real estate, right? If today most real estate developers recognize that North Bangalore areas around the new airport are very low as far as the water table is concerned. So they've recognized that if we don't do rainwater harvesting, if we don't create a new system, we're not going to be able to allow for people to live. Where do I provide water to people? Now, it's for me, it's that sort of recognition. Now people have finally got data that I can tell you as a business. Once I study your business and understand what dependencies it has, I can very quickly tell you that even in a short period of say 1 to 2 years, the types of impacts that this change in at a planetary level can have on your business at a localized level. And that's a big part of what we're trying to do. There isn't enough local information where all of this information is at a planetary level, which is to say that the world will have it, Calcutta will have it, Bombay will have it. But we're not saying that in Yashwantpur, this will be the problem. In Koramangala, this will be the problem. If you're in Pina and you run a factory, this is your problem. And that's a big part of our effort because the science exists. We just haven't localized it enough for people to really appreciate where the pain point is. And that's where the hope that if we can get more people to contribute to that, it'll have a difference.
Okay. I've got a question pointed at us specifically as a UX design firm. What do you think we can do uh, to help?
I mean, you guys are in the business of influencing the way people think. And I think that if you can get people to be more aware of how they should think about these problems and actually help them not just understand the problem, but how do you design for it? Uh, and even as I think as an organization that today, I think if you look at a lot of the studies, most young people are inclined to want to consume or work with people who are deeply conscious about the environment. So not only is it sort of a selling point to get people to want to work with you, but people are also making choices on consumption based on where you are in the environmental scale. A lot of young people, and there's a whole bunch of reports out there that actually talk about studies that talk about consumption patterns or consumption aspirations for people below the age of 20 today. And it's quite amazing. Many of them, and the study that I'd shown you, it's telling us about 70% of people below the age of 70 do see this as an emergency. Now, if I see it as an emergency, I'm likely to respond in a certain way. So I think from that perspective, as an organization, if that's your target audience, if young people, I think that there is a massive push now for companies to want to who want to stay relevant to actually cater to trying to address this problem, because that's not just an incentive to bring people in. From a consumption perspective also, it's starting to have an impact on them.
It's also a situation like we are slowly boiling. No, it hasn't become emergent enough, I think, for people to sense it on a daily basis. Isn't that one of the big issues?
I mean, it's an interesting point, right? Because I think that a lot of us who perhaps are in this room are likely to be at a slightly privileged level. If you ask this question of somebody who is working on a farm in Tumkur, or even sort of say 50 kilometers from Bangalore, the reality is very different. Uh, I mean, I was recently in Coorg and I spoke to, it was, for me, it was a little bit of a light bulb moment. And I assumed that a lot of this idea of climate change and the science was something that only the privileged few understood. And I was speaking to him, and this is he's sort of running an agricultural farm in Coorg, and he was saying that he told me so. So I said, hey, how are things here? And he said, no, we're in deep trouble, because he said climate change is affecting the way that I grow plants, or I sort of grow my farm. And I said, climate change, you know what that means? He said, of course. He says, I see it every day. For the last 10 years, I can see the deterioration that's happening, and I don't know what to do. I'm really sort of struggling. I know my water table has dropped. A lot of my sort of plants are not growing in the same way. I'm not getting the same predictable thing. So a lot of this is actually, while people may not understand it in the scientific way that we are, the people on the ground, I mean, there are literally islands across the planet that where the water levels, there is, I forget the name, but there is an island now that is seeking to actually buy land in another part of the world so that they can move all of their people to it. Because
Mauritius.
yeah, and their vulnerability is the next 1 or 2 years. It's not even like 9 years away. So some people will be far more affected. Migration, I mean, climate refugees across the planet, whether that's Africa. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that are happening today, right? The locust attack that happened recently is on account of what's happening with climate in Africa and the Middle East. Lightning strikes in Bihar. We've lost over 100 people. I mean, it's bizarre. We've never had that sort of loss, and that's happened through lightning strikes, and that's happened over the course of last year. The cyclones across the planet and the extreme sort of levels have happened. So these are things that are already playing out. These are not, in that sense, things that are that far down the line. So I do feel like there are things that today there's enough out there for us to sit up and notice. And it's not us, the ones who are most vulnerable are at the lowest end of the system. And they have absolutely nobody's looking out for them. So it is very, very worrying if you fall within that segment.
Just so that we can leave this on a slightly more positive note, would you just share anything that you've found which is hopeful? You know,
I mean, I work on optimism. I'm sorry I had to make this a slightly sort of difficult, but I feel like if we can't appreciate the problem,
right?
we're not going to be able to solve. The first aspect of this for me is the recognition that it is a problem. I think there are loads of solutions. I mean, the reason I sort of moved away from the law was truly because I believed in that. I saw that there are a whole bunch of incredible people out there working on these solutions. Those solutions exist. Like I said, it's a matter of us building more awareness, getting more people involved in the issue, and then coming together to really work on the problem. So, I mean, I can share maybe I can do another one with just happy, wonderful stories of people doing great things, and they do exist.
Yeah. No, this is very important, but it's also I think there's so many people participating also that I'm seeing on a constant basis. So that swell is also very hopeful to me. I think that's important to notice as well. Right. Great. Thank you so much, Ajay. Thank you so much for doing this. It's been a wonderful chat with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Bye.
Bye.